Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services online public input session on Chapter Env-Sw 300, titled Solid Waste Program Permits of the New Hampshire Code of Administrative Rules for Solid Waste Management. This public input session, including the associated comment period, is being held in advance of the formal rulemaking process to provide a broad opportunity for all interested parties to share their ideas and concerns regarding the solid waste permitting rules. Please note that there will be future opportunities to provide public comment during the formal rulemaking process. So in addition to today's session, we encourage you attendees to submit comments in writing to DES before June 21st, 2023 at 4 p.m. My name is Leah McKenna, and I am the Administrator of the Solid Waste Management Bureau in the Waste Management Division of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. I will be moderating this public input session. Please note that during this session, we may refer to the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services as NHDES, the department, or DES. The agenda for this meeting is shown on the slide. First, I'll introduce the team that we have here today and provide some guidance on using the GoToWebinar software for those who are unfamiliar. Then we will hear from Jamie Colby, who will give us a brief description of the existing solid waste rules and will present ideas the department is considering for rule changes. This will be followed by an opportunity for public input. The meeting will end no later than 4 p.m. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the team that we have supporting this public input session. From the Solid Waste Management Bureau, we have Jamie Colby, Emily Jones, and Laura Filio. And then in addition, assisting us in running the software for the meeting are Tara Albert of the Solid Waste Management Bureau and Julie Ashton of the Waste Management Division. Please reach out to Julie Ashton if you have technical difficulties with the GoToWebinar software. As previously stated, the purpose of today's public input session is to provide a broad opportunity for all interested parties to share their ideas and concerns regarding the solid waste program permitting rules in advance of DES's work to draft proposed rule amendments. This public input session is not required by statute or rule, but we wanted to provide an informal opportunity for the public to propose changes to this chapter prior to starting the formal rulemaking process. Once the formal rulemaking process starts, we will propose specific rule language changes on which the public can comment. We do not have specific program or proposed rule language at this time, just ideas under consideration. As noted on the slide, this chapter is set to expire on July 1st next year, 2024. To ensure readoption of this chapter before it expires, DES will soon start drafting proposed language. Now, Jamie Colby will provide a brief introduction to the existing solid waste rules. Jamie will then outline multiple proposed rule concepts or ideas under consideration by DES for Chapter Env-Sw 300, the Solid Waste Program Permitting Rules. Jamie?
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. As Leah stated, my name is Jamie Colby, and I'm supervisor of the Engineering and Permitting section in the Solid Waste Management Bureau at DES. I'd like to start by briefly explaining the existing solid rules, and then I'll move on to present several rule adjustment ideas the department is considering. And one of the reasons I stumble over brief is this might not be our briefest explanation of the rules, but I think it will help to give a little depth. So the solid waste rules interpret and implement the requirements in RSA 149M, the Solid Waste Management Act. These rules effectively instruct DES and parties interested in solid waste management how to carry out the requirements in the statute. As such, the rules tend to be much more detailed than the statute, as they need to provide more concrete how-to information. It's important to understand a bit about the structure of New Hampshire solid waste rules. The solid waste rules are layered like a pyramid, one on top of the other. For those who have attended previous public input sessions, this pyramid should start to look familiar. At the base of our pyramid, we have rules about definitions, processes, and procedures. These are rules that describe how to implement the solid waste program and permitting system required by statute. On top of that foundation, we have rules applicable to all solid waste facilities. These are known as the universal facility requirements. For example, all solid waste facilities are required to be operated in a manner that controls to the greatest extent practicable litter, odor, and noise. On top of the universal requirements, we have rules applicable only to permitted facilities. These are known as the additional facility requirements. For example, all permitted facilities are required to file annual reports. Finally, we have rules about specific types of solid waste facilities. Note that there are only 3 types of solid waste facilities: collection, storage, and transfer facilities where waste comes in and waste goes out, processing and treatment facilities where waste comes in and a product and a waste go out, and then landfills where waste comes and waste stays. This afternoon, we are specifically seeking input on the requirements for solid waste facility permitting. That's a foundational rule in the lowest level of our rules pyramids. You can see it here in bold italic at the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Again, this is the chapter that describes how to implement the solid waste program and permitting system required by statute. The organization of the chapter for solid waste permitting is shown on this slide and the next slide. The chapter parts are numbered ENV-SW 301 through ENV-SW 316. Because it's such a critical chapter in the solid waste program, I am going to take time to generally describe the various parts of the chapter. So Part 301 describes the purpose and applicability requirements of the solid waste rules generally, which is to implement RSA 149N. Part 302 describes the system of permits used to implement RSA 149M, when a permit is required, and exemption from the permit requirements. Part 303 identifies requirements for filing applications, registrations, and reports under the solid waste rules. This section includes items such as the basic filing requirements, like signing an application, notices of filing requirements. For example, the requirements for when an applicant needs to tell others that they are applying for a permit, and requirements for an applicant to self-identify its compliance history. Part ENV-SW 304 describes application receipt and review procedures, including processing timelines, complete application determinations, and responding to incomplete applications, and technical review of applications. I note that under the solid waste rules, the department processes applications in what is effectively 3 stages. We do a basic filing determination that is similar in most other programs to an administrative completeness determination. Was the application signed? Was the fee provided? Did you fill out all the boxes you needed to? The second stage is a completeness determination. That is, does the department have all of the information necessary to make a decision on the application? And then the third stage is a technical review, where the application is reviewed to determine if it actually meets the requirements of the rules and whether there are grounds for application denial. If a public hearing is required, that also occurs during the technical review, and those requirements are identified in Part ENV-SW 304. In the GoToWebinar dashboard handout sections, we provided a flow chart that shows how a standard permit application is processed. This may help with understanding the flow in Part ENV-SW 304 of the rules. Part ENV-SW 305 describes how a decision is made and issued on a solid waste permit application and includes the grounds for denial of a permit or permit modification, as well as how decisions are to be issued and what must be included in a decision. Part ENV-SW 306 identifies actions the department can take to revoke, suspend, or modify a permit, license, registration, or other approval issued by DES under RSA 149M and the solid waste rules. Specifically, the section includes the procedures DES must follow and the grounds, known as good cause, for revoking, suspending, or modifying a permit. Part ENV-SW 307 describes how permits existing prior to the current rules are to be handled and includes provisions for reissuance of older permits. Part ENV-SW 308 is reserved, that is, it currently does not contain any rules. Part Env-Sw 309 describes how landfills that stopped operating before July 10th, 1981 can be registered and thus excluded from regulation under the New Hampshire solid waste rules. Part Env-Sw 310 describes the fee structure and fees to be paid when applying for a solid waste permit. Wait, we're not done yet. Chapter Env-Sw 300 then goes into detail about the permit and permit modification types and the application requirements for each. There are only 4 types of permits: permits by notification, sometimes referred to as PBNs, research and development permits, R&D permits, emergency permits, and standard permits. Parts Env-Sw 311, 312, 313, and 314 describe the provisions for obtaining each of these permit types, including the application content requirements. Part Env-Sw 315 describes how to modify the 4 permit types, including which modifications each permit type is eligible for and the permit modification application requirements. Note that there are 5 types of permit modifications available, ranging from a Type 1 through a Type 5. Finally, Part Env-Sw 316 describes the requirements relative to background investigations for solid waste facility permit applicants, which are part of determining, in accordance with RSA 149M9 Roman numeral 3 and RSA 149M9 Roman numeral 9, whether there are potential grounds for denial of an application based on an applicant's reliability, expertise, integrity, and competence to operate a solid waste facility, as well as their criminal history, if any. That's it for context or background on the solid waste rules and the chapter we are specifically discussing today, which is Env-Sw 300, the solid waste permitting program. Now we can move on to ideas under consideration by DES to update chapter 300. As is typical of a rule readoption effort, DES proposes to clarify language and ensure consistency with RSA 149M and with other administrative rules and laws. DES is also considering the addition of provisions for a facility to be determined or deemed closed, for permits to be terminated or retired as a function of rule when, for example, a business is abandoned or has dissolved, voluntary surrender or retirement or termination of a permit, and superseding of one permit by another, basically when an applicant seeks a replacement permit. DES is also considering updates to application requirements that are applicable to most or all application types. Specifically, DES is considering the addition of requirements for a pre-application meeting for certain types of applications, such as standard permits and Type 1A permit modifications. DES is also considering requiring applicants to identify on an application if construction is required, requiring that if a proposed permittee is a business entity, they confirm that they've registered with the New Hampshire Secretary of State, requiring that if a proposed permittee is a business entity, they provide the business's organizational information or organizational chart, and as required by statute, DES will propose to include permit and permit modification application forms in the rules themselves. That is, these forms will be part of the rules. Now we'll move on to changes that are not general or global. DES is not proposing changes to the applicability and purpose part of the chapter. The department is, however, proposing to clarify the permit exemption for asphalt, brick, and concrete facilities, and that is contained, if anybody wants to take a look, in Env-Sw 302.03 B as in boy 9. And add a permit exemption for bench scale teaching activities at academic institutions. In Part Env-Sw 303, DES is considering the addition to the basic filing requirements a provision for when an applicant that does not application, that does not meet basic filing requirements is considered withdrawn. Basically, if somebody doesn't sign it, provide the fee, and they don't get back to us in a reasonable period of time, we want to consider the application withdrawn so it doesn't linger. DES is also considering updating the application registration and reporting submittal requirements to prioritize electronic filing. We may still reserve some ability to request paper copies, and engineering drawings, plans may still be required in paper, still getting a feel for what is appropriate there. In addition, still in the 303 section, DES is considering updating the notification requirements to include requirement that each tenant in a multi-tenant building or on multi-tenant parcels be notified when abutters are required to be notified of application filing or other activities at a solid waste facility. We found this as a bit of a gap in the rule. The property owner might be notified, but not the tenants. We're considering reflecting changes in entity names. So for example, DREAD is now DNCR, Dancer. Considering an option to provide a paper copy of an application upon request. So for example, if the Rivers program at DES is required to be notified and currently provided a paper copy, allow that program to request if they want a paper copy or if they want an electronic copy. Also proposing to make consistent when an application is required to include a copy of the notification of filing and proof of notification. The rules appear a little inconsistent here. When do you have to show us the notification of filing, and when do you have to show us proof that you made notifications to the appropriate people? We're also considering clarifying locally accessible to mean a locally accessible public place, such as town hall or public library. In Part Env-Sw 304, the department is considering clarifying the start date of the application processing timelines, updating application review timelines, including processing times to reflect changes in RSA 149 M9 Roman numeral 8, I have to do the math, updating public hearing requirements, notification requirements to reflect changes in RSA 149 M7 Roman numeral 3, and an option for a public comment period for certain application types. For example, the Type 1B and the Type 4 application types. Type 4 is a transfer of a permit from one entity to another. There's no current mechanism in the rule for a public comment period or public input. In Part Env-Sw 305, and I will switch the slide for you, DES is considering adding a permit expiration date if a notice of intent to operate is not filed within either 1 or 2 years of permit issuance. Sometimes we issue a permit and the permittee takes no action with it. So instead of having these lingering permits out there with no activity, we want to be able to close them out. There are no changes under consideration at this time for Part Env-Sw 306. With regards to Env-Sw 307, DES is considering adjusting the language to clarify that a permit can be reissued to reflect revised rules. For example, DES updated the composting rules to allow composting of meat and dairy at permit by notification facilities. We would clarify that a permit by notification can be reissued to reflect this change in rule. In Part Env-Sw 308, DES is considering adding the General Permit Program. The General Permit Program is intended to reduce administrative burden while achieving consistency in regulating category-specific facilities. Because the program will be organized around category-specific facility types, such as motor vehicle salvage yards or scrap metal facilities, the general permit will only be available for specific types or categories of facilities and will not be a broad-based replacement for existing permit types. DES will host a separate public input session or more formal advanced rulemaking session for the general permit program sometime in the next few months. As such, we won't go into specifics about the program right now. In part Env-Sw 309, DES is considering adding the ability to deny a pre-1981 landfill registration request, and once registered, adding a requirement that the pre-1981 landfill status be recorded in a property's chain of title. No changes are under consideration relative to the fees in part Env-Sw 310. Now we'll move into the permit types. There are no changes under consideration relative to part Env-Sw 311 for permits by notification. Part Env-Sw 312 regarding research and development permits, DES is considering expanding access to the R&D permits by adjusting the funding and or supervision requirements for these types of solid waste facilities. No changes are under consideration at this time for part Env-Sw 313 relative to emergency permits. DES is considering adding provisions to the standard permit application to require more robust information be provided when an unconventional design or process is proposed at a solid waste facility. Just give us a little more information to work with. DES is considering several ideas relative to part Env-Sw 315, the permit modification requirements. Quick note, there are 5 permit modification types, as I mentioned before, type 1 through type 5. And they each cover a different area. Type 1As are the big permit modification types. They're very similar to a standard permit. That's you want to increase your capacity. You want to build more landfill footprint. There's a type 2, these are the final construction drawings. A type 3 is more of a notification to the department something's changing. A type 4 is a permit transfer. A type 5 is about record storage. And then there's a type 1B, and that's sort of the miscellaneous. Anything that doesn't fit into the other existing types goes into a type 1B application. So the department is considering clarifying eligibility of permits by notification for permit modifications, little murky there. Considering better aligning the type 1A, which is typically the most complicated modification type, and the standard permit application requirements, and it's particularly relative to landfill expansions. Considering expanding the scope of a type 3 permit modification, which is a notification style modification, to include landfill gas system expansions that already have preliminary design approval and changes in property owner. There's currently no notification requirement when there's a change in property owner. We're also considering expanding the scope of the type 5, which is about record storage, to address the option of electronic record storage. And last but not least is part Env-Sw 316 relative to an applicant's performance history. At this time, there are no changes under consideration. Remember, you can download these slides from the handout section in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we plan to post them to the solid waste webpage on the DES website within the next few business days. The recording of this presentation will be posted to DES's YouTube channel. The rules in the solid waste statute are available online through either the DES website or the state legislature's website, and links to those are included in the last slide in this presentation. Thank you for listening. I really hope this presentation has helped provide some context for the rules, the types of changes DES is considering for the solid waste permitting rules, and has perhaps inspired questions and more ideas that you can share with us. Leah?
Thanks, Jamie. In a few moments, we will take a break. However, I would like to go over the ground rules for providing public input first. Our objective this afternoon is to give everyone who wishes to speak a reasonable opportunity to do so. After you have provided your name in accordance with the instructions, I will call on people to speak in the order displayed on the screen. Based on the number of attendees, I request that you limit your time to 4 minutes, and I will attempt to alert you at the 3-minute mark. Please graciously yield the floor within 4 minutes so that I can call the next speaker in line. We are frequently asked whether a speaker can yield their time to another speaker of their choice. This practice will not be allowed during this session. Instead, we intend to proceed through the list of names to give everyone the time they need to provide their comments. So in other words, the person you might wish to yield your time to will have plenty of time to provide input. They will just need to add their name in the question box and wait for their turn in line. When I call your name, if you decide you do not wish to speak at that time, just let me know, and we will place your name at the end of the list to be called on after all of the other speakers have cycled. Again, to reiterate, written comments may be submitted in writing to DES at any time before June 21st at 4 p.m. instead of or in addition to providing comments at this public input session. Please submit comments using either the DES mailing address or by email at swmbrules@des.nh.gov. And please note there will be future opportunities to provide public comment during the formal rulemaking process. Please listen closely to the following instructions on how to provide oral comments using GoToWebinar. And as a reminder, these instructions are not applicable to our telephone-only attendees who are in listen-only mode. For oral comments, we will enable the GoToWebinar question function. Using this function, you will let DES know that you would like to provide input by entering your full name into the GoToWebinar question box. The information typed in the question box is not your public comment, and you should not type any substantive content in this box. In order to be added to the list to provide oral comments, you must enter your name. If you are a state senator or representative, please also write this before your name. Please note when you are unmuted and speaking, DES and all other attendees will hear you, but your video feed will not be transmitted. Tara, would you please enable the question function and confirm that it is available to attendees?
I have enabled it and confirming that it is available.
Thank you, Tara. So everyone should now see the question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. If you want to provide input, again, please type your name in the question box and not your comment, and hit enter to submit. We will be monitoring the list of attendees who are submitting this information, and we will place your name in the queue. Remember that if you need technical assistance with getting onto the list to provide comments, Julie Ashton of DES is available by phone at 603-271-7837 or by email at julie.a.ashton@des.nh.gov. We will now take a short break to enter names on the list, and we will be back in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, our objective this afternoon is to give everyone who wishes to speak a reasonable opportunity to do so. If your comments will not fit inside the allotted time of 4 minutes, you are more than welcome to enter your name again in the question box to speak at the end of the queue. Also, please be respectful of each other. There may be differing viewpoints represented by the participants of the session, and issues can be emotionally charged. In all cases, I ask that all participants honor the process of being able to hold a public input session to hear differing viewpoints and concerns by extending each other courtesy and civility. We will begin hearing public input at this time. I will call on individuals one at a time. When called on, please ensure that your microphone is not muted and begin your comments by stating your name. I see that we have multiple people who have indicated that they would like to provide comments. Our first person will be Alan Palmer, and then we have Bob Brillo. Mr. Palmer, when I turn the floor over to you, please start by stating your name, and you now have the floor.
Mr. Palmer, you need to unmute your microphone.
How are we doing?
Good, thank you. We can hear you.
Good. Very simple question. I went on the website trying to find prior public sessions on the other sections of the rules and was not able to do so. And I have to believe that you have a site out there somewhere that goes to the different presentations and perhaps even the handouts that we could look at.
Mr. Palmer, that's really good feedback. Actually, the presentations are not posted. There is a YouTube recording, but we pulled down the slides. We can talk about that internally and consider reposting them.
I'd appreciate that. It is entertaining as these are. It's always good to have the hard copy to read, you know.
Sure. Yeah, again, those YouTube videos, they are posted on YouTube, but I appreciate what you're saying.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Palmer. Next, we have Bob Brillo. After that, Lois Cody.
Good afternoon. It's Bob Brillo. My comments are on the application processing flowchart and the relevant rules that are applicable to that. The rules define completeness simply as an application satisfies content and formatting. I think that implies that you've addressed requirements in the rules, but it doesn't imply that there's going to be a sort of a technical review of all that information before the application's deemed complete. And I know, Jamie, you described how you view it as this is a determination that you have all the information you need to make a decision. And having been through a standard permit recently, you put a lot of time and effort into that process of getting to complete, more so than you may in the technical review portion. So, with that said, you may want to consider expanding the definition of completeness to include exactly what it is that you're doing and what you're looking for at that stage. And the way the chart is currently formatted, there's only 60 days between receiving an application, determining if it's administratively complete, and then going through your application completion process. And I think you may agree that that's not enough time if you're going to put that much effort into the completeness part of this. Because after that, it goes, once it's deemed complete, it goes right to a public hearing scheduling and decision. So, maybe there could be a slot in there for technical review and more time given up front there. That's all I have.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that feedback. The statute was modified to give us more time. We haven't updated the rules yet, so we're working on that's going to be folded into this. We hope to fold that into this rulemaking effort to update those timelines. You make a good point. You make a good point about there's that administrative completeness part. Once we have a administratively complete application, the clock ticks, and we have 60 days to determine whether or not it's complete. And on the big applications, that also involves a substantial amount of the technical review. Well, it's kind of divided into these subjective 3 parts. we probably do 85% of the technical review
Right.
and completeness.
And there's a lot of information in a standard permit.
Yes, a lot.
So I'd be forgiving a little more time. I mean, other bureaus, like the Wetland Bureau, has a year, to deal with all this. AOT has a short time fuse, but there are other examples, I think, where there's a reasonable amount of time given to getting the applications through the process.
Yeah, and again, it was updated 149 M9. The processing timelines were updated. If you want, you could take a look in there.
Oh, okay.
It did give us more time, especially if there's a public hearing. We got even an additional 60 days if there's a public hearing involved. So we're excited to update the rules for that.
That's it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Brillo. Thank you for the comments. Next, we will hear from Lois Cody, and then we have Sam Nicolai. So, Ms. Cody, please unmute yourself, state your name.
Hello, thank you. I'm really here to learn. So what I have is questions. Two. The first is about the pre-1981 landfill group being no longer subject to regulation, and what is implied in that when a landfill becomes a hazard, and who's responsible and how would it be enforced? That's one question. The second question has to do with a forward-looking issue. How will, if it passes, the passage of Senate Bill 61 regarding landfills affect your planning right now for these changes? So I'll give the 4 minutes to you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Jamie, would you like to, I can, for your second question, Ms. Cody, thank you for both. The second question you're asking relative to change, the anticipated passing or some action taken for SB 61 is really any changes to rules will likely impact the chapter on landfills. That's Env-Sw 800. Anything beyond logistics in 300, I don't think anything will be affected in this chapter. But if you weren't able to attend the Env-Sw 800 public input session, that along with the rest of our chapters of rules are all expiring July 1st of 2024. So we're going to be making changes to all of our rules, which of course, when legislation is introduced, is going to impact that in some way. So we're paying attention very closely to what's happening over in the legislature, and anything that will affect these sets of rules will obviously be made before July 1st, 2024. Jamie, do you want to handle, if you feel like I haven't finished that question, please go ahead. Or if you want to handle Ms. Cody's first question.
Yeah, no, Leah, that sounded right. SB 67 is, if I've got the number right, sorry, is predominantly going to affect the Env-Sw 800 rule chapter. And if you, ma'am, if you look in the right hand, the handouts, there's a memo for prior public input sessions. You could go watch the 800 one. I think questions like that came up during that session as well. And basically, when the law changes, we make appropriate changes as rule as needed. With regards to pre-1981 landfills, that's a little tricky. There's a provision in our rules that says if the landfill stopped receiving waste before July 10th, 1981, they can register. If they register, they're no longer subject to the solid waste rules. They are, however, still subject to other regulatory requirements. So if it becomes like hazardous waste site, like a Superfund or a brownfields, then it would go to those programs at DES for management. If it starts to have an effect on groundwater quality, drinking water quality, it might end up with the drinking water programs. So it depends on what the issue is that comes up. There are still other regulatory programs that would have authority to address issues from a pre-1981 landfill. It just wouldn't be under the solid waste rules.
Thank you both very much. Very helpful.
Thank you very much for attending, and thank you for your comments. Next, we will hear from Sam Nicolai, followed by Eric Steinhauser. Sam, will you unmute yourself, state your name?
Good afternoon, this is Sam Nicolai. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comments, and we'll look forward to providing written comments as well. Thought it would be useful, two areas of oral comments. One of them would be the potential changes to Env-Sw 305. It certainly makes sense to have some kind of time frame on a permit being issued and not acted upon, so that you didn't have something hanging out there forever. I think our comment would be to encourage perhaps a little bit of a longer time frame. While not common, there are situations where a permit might be issued and folks might be waiting for other permits to be issued and or construction timeframes to be done. So it certainly would make sense to have some kind of limit. I'm aware of at least one other local state or one nearby state that uses a 5-year time frame where you've got some limit that's out there, but I worry a little bit that under certain circumstances, 1 to 2 years could be a little bit problematic, although you certainly wouldn't see that very often. The other area of comment, and it does sound like the department is already considering it, is just a general encouragement that as technology continues to advance, we see more diverse methods and processes for waste management and waste handling, waste processing, and to build as much flexibility as you can within, I guess maybe ENV SW 312 and 314, where alternative methods of managing waste can be proposed underneath those guidelines. We'll try to provide some written comments as to where we think flexibility could be built in, but certainly as the rules can allow those kinds of technologies to be implemented and bugs to be shaken out and good processes to work, I think it's helpful if the regulations could allow that. I certainly don't see this industry as static and think that we will continue to see innovation going forward. And if we can have rules that will help us serve that innovation, I think we'll all be better off. And we'll certainly try to provide some more details into the written comments. But thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Nicolai. Next, we will hear from Eric Steinhauser, and then we have Sarah Doucette. Mr. Steinhauser, please unmute yourself, state your name.
Good afternoon, Eric Steinhauser. Can you hear me? Awesome. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to do this and spending the time looking at the rules to make New Hampshire a better and safer place. My comments are going to sound like questions and don't feel like you need to answer them. It's not the time to necessarily do that or debate that, but just kind of what's on our mind. One thing that I would perhaps can be incorporated into the 300 rules is other states have a kind of an agency coordination. So when large applications are submitted, other parts of DES like wetlands or air or whoever can be included in that pre-application process automatically versus we tend to have to set that up more of an ad hoc type of thing if it could be part of the rule that those parties can be a part of that meeting and then determine whether they need to be part of the process or not at that time. Just something to consider. There was a comment or consideration for organization charts for businesses. I'm not sure what that needs to look like. Some organizations change what their org charts look like from time to time. So at the time of an application, by the time, if there's a year or whatever process, that organization chart might look different by the time the permit is issued. Hate to have to see that become a permit mod at the time of the permit issuance. And also what degree of detail does that need? So just kind of consider what that really needs to look like as part of an application. We have sites where the landowners have many tenants. And again, if we're doing an application and we're notifying perhaps hundreds of tenants and a tenant moves, or maybe several tenants move, or several residences have multiple tenants within the permitting process, that can be very burdensome and maybe not necessary. So if we can kind of think about what is really needed for that kind of notification, would be appropriate. Realize on slide 15, we talked about updating timelines. I haven't had a chance yet to look at what all the statutes are for what changes might be there, but it would have been a little more helpful to have a little bit more detail of what those specific updates to the review timelines, the hearing, whatever would have been. Anyway, just kind of as a comment there. We talked a little bit, I know I'm a little bit out of order on this one, type 1Bs and type 1As, type 1Bs being the catch-all. Perhaps there's just a type 1, which is your big one with the public notifications. Maybe there's a different type for the catch-alls. I know we've talked many times about projects, where does it fit in the permitting hierarchy? Perhaps there could be a little bit more definition exactly what these the catch-all really needs to be. So maybe more stuff needs to be in the 1A. I kind of hope not. Maybe more things fall into a 2 or a 3. But anyway, it's just a little perhaps awkward for folks new to the process that understand a 1A, 1B, what really is the definition there.
Eric, that's 3.5 minutes just to give you an update.
Okay, great. So on 309, for the pre-1981 landfills, I'm not quite sure why you would want to deny a registration. My understanding that rule is so that we can identify where they are. And so it can go into, as Jamie said, the different parts of DES as appropriate. Denying that registration, I'm not sure is a benefit to the state. And the other one on 314, unconventional, we might want to consider that as innovative. And I think we want to kind of really understand what that means in the process. And conventional in New Hampshire might be conventional in New York. So there's some definitions that we want to understand. And then lastly, in my last seconds, could DES please consider draft permits? Other states do that. It takes away a little confusion and probably maybe some appeals by applicants if they understood what's coming at them so they can better prepare for potential changes they were not anticipating during the application process. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for your comments. Next, we will hear from Sarah Doucette.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, great.
Yes.
This is Sarah Doucette. I don't want to get too specific about this, but I'm interested. I think it's 316. You talked a little bit about prior history and maybe credentialing. I'm aware of a situation where an engineer who seems not to be licensed in the state has been a primary player with one of our suppliers of landfill services in the state, and that's been questioned over more than a year with the authorities in the state who deal with licensing. And I haven't been able to see any clarity other than that this person was licensed under an internship program in the state many years ago. I just wondered what sort of bar you set for the primary engineering consultants who are overseeing applications to the department.
Jamie, is that something you're able to explain a little?
Yes. Well, a little bit. So Env-Sw 316 doesn't really have to do with whether or not somebody's a qualified engineer. That's really about the applicant's performance history, their background, whether or not there's a provision in the statute where the department may deny an application if an applicant doesn't demonstrate reliability, expertise, things like that. The engineer question, when it really only applies when the work involves engineering. So, and that's something implemented and enforced by the Board of Professional Engineers. So it wouldn't be our program I have an obligation as a licensed professional engineer. If I see somebody doing engineering work who's not a qualified engineer to do that work, I have an obligation to report it to the board. Ultimately, it would be the board's responsibility to chase that down and determine what's appropriate or not. I hope that provides context or helps. That help?
I hear what you're saying. I mean, this is a person whose name I see on applications and on communication with DES all the time. I know the licensing board has been approached, as I say, over more than a year and repeatedly, and there's been no response. So it's been quite an unsatisfactory situation, considering this person has a tremendous amount of responsibility and apparently credibility, because I continue to see this name. Do you have any advice for me on how to learn more about this, Jamie?
You can review the Board of Engineers requirements. You know, I've multiple times gone to their rules and statutes. The thing I usually have to look up the most is what is the definition of the work of an engineer. You know, we have different situations in New Hampshire. Landfill permittees are not obligated to have an engineer on their staff. They are required to use an engineer when the work of an engineer is required. So that's why many of them will hire consultants to do the engineering work. In New Hampshire, I know that one of our landfill permittees has engineers on staff, licensed professional engineers, but not many of the others do not have licensed professional engineers on their staff. They use consultants to do the engineering work. And just a little context on engineering, all engineers go through the same process, right? We get our degree, we pass something called the Fundamentals of Engineering exam, then we would become what's known as, in Vermont, it's known as an engineer intern. That's where I passed the Fundamentals exam. In New Hampshire, it's known as an engineer in training. That's very common. So you get your degree, you pass this Fundamentals exam that you know basics, science, math, physics, and then you have to be experienced. You have to gain 4 or more years of experience. This is rough. The rules and regs are a little different. You'll have to look in detail. So you have to gain so much experience, and then you can apply to sit for the professional engineer's exam. You have to demonstrate you've had the appropriate experience, so the appropriate education. If the board approves you to sit for the professional engineer's exam, you do that. If you pass the exam, you can become a licensed professional engineer. And then you can do the work of an engineer without the supervision of a professional licensed engineer. You could basically hang your own shingle. And that's a very normal flow of things. Some folks who pass the fundamentals exam choose never to take the professional engineering exam. They just don't need to. They don't want to. There are many reasons why people might not take it or might not pass it. So that's a brief overview of the whole kind of, this is how you get to be a licensed professional engineer. I kind of circle back on that. You know, if it requires the work of a professional engineer, then we would look for that qualification. Otherwise, it's not, the permittees are not required to be or have professional engineers on their direct staff.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, Jamie.
Sure.
Thank you for your comment, Ms. Doucette. We now have John Tuthill.
Mr. Tuthill, you have to click the microphone to unmute yourself.
Go. I think that's it. Yes. You good?
Good.
Question on pre-application. This has been an issue in the past where a project may be discussed at DES sometimes months, sometimes many, many months before the public is made aware that there is a prospective applicant preparing to submit an application. And I would like to know a little bit more about at what point the public is notified that an application is forthcoming in process. In other words, we often will get a notice of public hearing on the DES web page, but by that point, we've already seen, going back to the record afterwards, There's been a lot of discussion at Hazen Drive with a company pursuing a permit. At that point, you may even have seen the determination of completeness, at least at Air Resources. There's a draft permit issued. So basically, the entire process has gone forward until quite late when the public is notified that they may request a public hearing or make comment. But I'd like to find out if there's some way that the rules could be more transparent when a project is being discussed at the agency prior to a formal application being filed.
So you had asked a question and then you also gave us your comment. Thank you. I appreciate what you're commenting on. The current rules require that abutters, if it's a big application, we're talking standard permit, landfill expansion things, abutters and potentially affected entities like Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, the Rivers Program, that they be notified no earlier than 30 days before the application is filed. So there's a 30-day window that notification is required, but it could be on the day the application is filed as well. That's what the rules currently stipulate. So they get notice of filing, and then they would get notice of public hearing. They would get notice of completeness determination, but this is obviously that very select, or not select group, specific group identified in the rules. So I appreciate what you're saying. We are considering adding the pre-application meeting, but we haven't tried to flesh out, we don't have any draft language. We haven't tried to flesh out what that would look like. Certainly be interested in everyone's comments on that idea.
Yeah, I'd urge you to look at that issue carefully and make sure the municipalities have the opportunity to be perhaps at those meetings or at least made aware of those meetings. Also, on notification of abutters, we've run into a situation in Claremont where a railroad company owned the right-of-way and abutters on the other side of that right-of-way did not get notice. Whereas I think with a road, abutters were getting notice, and that became a problem.
Okay, was that a right-of-way, an easement? Yeah, okay.
It was owned outright. The railroad owned the property outright, but the railroad was actually part of the project, so it left a number of abutters without notice until quite late in the process.
Okay, thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Railroads are under rules often.
These input sessions are just as much for us selfishly as they are for you folks. So if you have ideas, as we're starting to draft these rules, we welcome them. So please put pen to paper, if you will, and send us some information as to kind of what you're thinking. That would be very helpful for us.
Okay, and final comment, I did think a couple of your proposals look positive. So thank you for that, and we'll put in some written comments.
Thank you for your comments. So I'm going to hold the session open just for another moment to see if we have any last minute folks who might like to speak. Seeing no one else who wishes to provide comments, I'm going to prepare to close this. Yes.
Leah, we have someone else. He just popped in. I was going to type that.
Okay. All right, no worries. Okay, Eric Steinhauser, please unmute.
Hi again. So the last part I wanted to bring up was some of the, I think it's under this rule, notifications to municipalities, other public entities. On some of these, whether it's a town or a city, we're notifying a town administrator, town clerk, all the aldermen or selectmen, whatever. And cities, we're doing the mayors, the city clerk, and the city council people. Oftentimes, the same letter is going to the same address, being handled by the same person, and then distributed around. It just seems like kind of a waste of paper to send perhaps 15 copies of the same document to the same address. Just if you guys can kind of consider that, if we could send one, happy to do all the notifications, but it just seems like there's a lot of burden on the municipality to handle all this paperwork. That might not be as necessary, since the same clerk is going to be sending it to the same people. That's my last comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Okay, and I see Miss Sarah Doucette would like to speak again. Ms. Doucette, please unmute yourself.
Miss Doucette, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry, it seemed that I was. How's that? Yeah, great, thank you. I think this goes back to 316 regarding the historical performance of companies working in the state. And I recall being at a hearing some while back, in the last couple of years, maybe in Bethlehem, where that came up. And it seemed at the time we questioned certain accidents and historical experiences with the company that were very disturbing to the public, and whether I think this was an expansion permit that was in question. It seemed from your comments at that time that there were no hard and fast guidelines for you about when a company's history has been concerning enough that you would not allow an expansion or a new permit. I wonder if there's any way to beef that up so that it's not such a matter of subjective decision making, but there's a more objective criteria that everyone could be aware of. Yeah, that's the essence of my question.
So yes, if you to answer the question, any and all items in these rules are up for review and adjustment. So again, we welcome your thoughts. If you want to put those in writing, if you have some ideas, we are intending to make some changes to that chapter, that part of the chapter. Also knowing that there is some legislation looking at that specific portion too. Again, not the engineering part, but the ownership and whatnot for solid waste facilities. So we're going to need to make adjustments, likely based on whether or not those bills pass. But again, if you have some ideas on how to shore that up even more, we welcome them. So thank you for your comment.
Are you able to say what those bills are? I'm not sure I'm familiar with all of them.
I honestly can't remember the number. I want to say it's, if you want to give me a moment, I can try to find that. Hold on.
I mean, Jamie, I might say in the meantime, while Leah looks, so it sounds like there's some acknowledgement by the department that there could be more specific guidelines there that would be useful to you.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. You're right, it's not the most objective. There are some the grounds for denial in 305 are, they feel like they're objective on their face. There are certain parts of them that are a little trickier. One of them does have to do with that reliability expertise component. So I appreciate what you're saying. It's a hard thing to put boundary conditions on. Mm-hmm. So we are thinking about that and we're considering some things, but we don't have anything specific right now. We haven't had an opportunity to dig in on that one. If we can't do something this round, we might do it. We don't have to wait every 10 years to readopt or make adjustments to our rules. So if we can't do something now, we might do something in a couple years. I know that's not ideal, but sometimes we run into those hiccups where it's like we can't quite figure out what to write or how to write it in a manner that will pass muster with legal and with the Joint Legislative Committee on Rules. So sometimes we have to hold an idea until we can get back around to it. So, you know, we didn't list that here as an idea under consideration to make adjustments, try to make these more objective. It's just something that's a bit distant for us right now. We just haven't had the opportunity to kind of dig in on that question.
And
Well,
Mr.
I
Doucette, just
definitely-
until we,
Oh, yes,
so we can move, sorry, so we can move on to our next, Ms. Doucette, the bill in question that I was trying to come up with is SB 211, SB 211.
Very good,
Okay.
thanks.
You are welcome. And Mr.
And-
Tuttle.
There we are. Thank you. Just to comment quickly on following up on Sarah's comment and Eric's. I'm wondering just how sort of hard and fast the rules are applied and what DES's view is on that. I've seen at Air Resources Division, for example, where permit conditions are negotiated. And I've actually heard that mentioned at a solid waste working group meeting where the director and the chair had an exchange, and it certainly sounded as if there is opportunity and enough discretion at DES that perhaps some negotiation does go on with applicants in terms of what may actually appear in a permit. I wondered if you could address that question.
Mr. Tuttle, respectfully, I think that question goes beyond the scope of this input session, and I'm not sure that I or Jamie would be prepared to answer. I completely understand the question. I'm just not sure that either of us would be in any position to answer.
Okay, I understand
Jamie,
that.
unless, yeah, thank you.
It'd be
Jamie, do you have any
part of
comment?
legal and policy, but I think that the issue comes back to pre-application meetings and what sort of discussions take place before a completeness determination is made and before a permit is drafted. Thank you.
Sure, understood. Thank you very much. Tara, are you furiously typing anybody else's name in?
I do not see any names at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no one else who wishes to provide comments, I'm going to prepare to close the session. Again, please submit written comments to DES by 4 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st. They can be emailed or submitted by mail, and directions for submitting written comments are provided in the notice for this session, which is posted on the department's website. So we will now end the public input session. I want to thank you everyone for taking the time to participate, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.